So hi everyone. After almost 2 years, of interruption, the sociology department decided to relaunch its sociology talks series, and we're pleased to welcome Torsten Janson for this first online session. Torsten is a senior lecturer in Islamic studies at the Faculty of Humanities at Lund University. His most recent research focuses on Islamic nationalist imagination through the prism of Turkish memory, politics, and culture. And in this particular talk, he'll share with us his research on museum spaces and their contribution to the re-narration of Turkish-Islamic nationalism in the last few decades. Torsten, the floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Antoine. It's my absolute pleasure to be part of this forum, and I'm pleased to hear that you are restarting it. And if it will be continue in the Zoom format also, I will be sure to follow it also myself in the future. Then, on the other hand, of course, we hope to go back to business as usual and have real seminars also. But that's how it is, right? So a big thank to you, Antoine, for setting up this session. Especially great thanks also to Professor Ayşe Şaktamber, who I know was a little bit behind in recommending my name, since I had the pleasure of meeting Ayşe a couple of years ago within a workshop relating to heritage politics in Turkey, which will materialize into a book, which soon, I hope, will leave the presses. I'll come back to that in a minute. So, as a title for my talk today, I have chosen A Politics of Islamic Recollections, Ritualizing Memory in and Beyond Turkish Museal Space. And as a point of departure for this talk, I would like you to take you back to April of 2015, when, as you may recall, a religious theme park stirred controversy in Turkish media. Visitors to the central Üsküdar district of Istanbul could behold a replica of the Kabe sanctuary, the symbolic sanctuary, center, of course, of Islamic faith and pilgrimage. This was part of this religious theme park. Was named A Journey from Üsküdar to the Age of Felicity, incurring the notion of Asr-i Saadet, the ideal Islamic society during the lifetime of Prophet Muhammad and the early caliphs. Hang on, what happened now is my chair decided to go down. Give me a second.
Sure.
I'll change it.
All sorts of technical issues can happen on Zoom talks.
So that's material culture for you. Right. So the name of the theme park was then A Journey, or The Journey from Üsküdar to the Age of Felicity. This is, of course, then incurring the notion of Asr-i Saadet, the ideal Islamic society during the lifetime of Prophet Muhammad and the early caliphs. It was part of Kutlu Doğum Haftası, the sacred or the blessed birth week commemorating the birth of Prophet Muhammad. In this theme park, there were several objects referring to early Islamic history or legendary traditions. They were presented in a didactic framework with quasi-historical information texts directed to primarily a school audience. The religious overtones of this theme park were evident, which was very clear, not least from the inaugural speech of Mayor Hilmi Türkmen, where he said, and I quote, "We call our Üsküdar the land of Haram and the land of Kabe, offering those unable to make a pilgrimage to Mecca a tinge of its atmosphere." Ironically, this theme park was questioned from both secular and religious perspectives, but then, of course, with opposing arguments. Secularists, on their hand, criticized the introduction of Kutlu Haftası into the Turkish calendar of festivities and the school curriculum, not least, as a religious intrusion of Turkish public space in conflict then with secular republicanism. Not surprisingly, perhaps, the mini Kabe was immediately picked up in satire. Performance artist Cihat Duman, he dressed out in pilgrim attire to perform a mock Hajj to the mini Kaaba. And the satirical Le Mans paraded on its front page a cartoon where, as you can see, a man declares how he is conveniently choosing Üsküdar as the destination for this year's pilgrimage. Religious authorities, on their hand, evidently took the prospect of the model becoming subject for unwarranted ritual veneration quite seriously. According to a statement by the Turkish Presidency of Religious Affairs, the Diyanet, and I quote, "It would be a grave sin to perform circumambulation, tawaf, around the Kabe model." The Kabe structure was finally removed from the theme park during the night of the 24th of April, and the statements from Mayor Turkmen was also removed from the Üsküdar municipality webpage. In several ways, I think, the Kabe debacle, if you will, symbolizes something of a peak for inventive public orchestrations of religious expositions in public space. And it also captures important trajectories and discursive positions on the role of religion in contemporary Turkish nationalism. As I will argue today, museums and their recently strengthened interconnectedness with devotional traditions and ritual performativity provide a promising empirical field. Throughout modernity, museums have carried a central function as manifestations and narrative vehicles for nationalist imaginations. And if we understand politics as a public negotiation of common values, museum space can be theorized as inherently political. And as I will argue today, the increasingly sacralized political museal spaces are not confined to the interior of museum buildings, but they also encompass public space more broadly. As we know, the city of Istanbul today ambiguously provides both a stage for, as well as is an object of, sacralization and neo-Ottoman imaginations. And the focus of my research is to explore how such imaginations and practices are intertwined. With Paul Connerton, this pertains to exploring how social memory carries a composite nature of both inscriptions through canons, images, literatures, legal canons, etc., and commemorative performance, and how then museums function as junctures for such processes. Now, to make this a little bit more concrete, I will focus today on two examples. One museum, which is the Topkapi Palace Museum, and specifically its exposition of sacred relics, on the one hand, and on one ritual tradition, which is then Mevlid, the celebration of the birth of Prophet Muhammad, and how it's been reorchestrated within the concept of Kutlu Haftası, and then again reconceptualized as Mevlidi Nabi a few years ago. And then what I would like to do is try to destabilize the boundaries between them to demonstrate how they are flowing into each other and beyond each other into public space. So initially, we may perhaps think of this as a dual process of inside out and outside in, to the following effect. What I will try to demonstrate is that, especially then the relics exhibition of the Topkapi Palace Museum has been strongly ritualized from 1997 and then reorganized again in 2007 and then once again in 2020. So ritual museal space in itself museal space itself is being ritualized, but also is sort of turned inside out and attains a more public significance, because a number of shows of the holy relics have been organized throughout Turkish public space. For instance, in the Tunnel metro station in central Istanbul, as we see to the down right here. We have in Eyüp Sultan a similar photo exhibit. And then we have the Architectural Museum of Hatay and other spaces all through Turkey where these photographic shows of the sacred relics have emerged. So this is sort of one process, how ritualized museal spaces are being publicized on the one hand. On the other hand, we also then see a tendency where devotional traditions, and specifically the Prophet devotional traditions of Mevlid, sort of is being turned outside into museal exhibits. Because as part of the celebration of Kutluduğum Haftası, in a number of cases, especially from 2010 onwards, calligraphic shows connected then to Prophet devotion have been organized in distinct locations, not least in Hagia Sophia and in Topkapi Palace Museum. So the tradition of the calligraphic rendering of Prophet Muhammad in the form called then the Hilye Sherif, the noble portrait, the noble description, is then using calligraphic signs and quasi-iconic ways of representing Prophet Muhammad, which is then closely connected to a broader tradition of devotional prophet commemoration. And this art of Hilye Sherif has been strongly patronized by the municipalities and the governments during AKP government and rule. And then in 2016, it has been devoted its own museal space in the Hilye Sherif Tespe Museum in the Sultan Ahmed area of Istanbul. So this is one area where then devotional traditions sort of are then being turned outside in. But it's not only confined then to museums. Classrooms and education also have been strongly in focus of the state-run Mevlid celebrations yearly. And in schools, especially Imam Hatip schools, of course, a number of performances and decorative installations and art shows crafted by the students themselves have been suggested, strongly then picking up on themes from Mevlid devotional tradition, and also in its turn being sort of externalized into local communities, because as we see here from the high school in the Giresun district, here students, for instance, were crafting magnets with inscriptions of hadith that were then distributed among local businesses and the community as part of sort of then reaching out, sort of a dawah missionary activity. But then being orchestrated and conceptualized as an educational venture, because, as I will come back to later, the celebration of Kutlu Doğum Haftası was introduced formally within educational curriculum from 2000 and I think it was 12 onwards. And also not only in the schoolroom, but also in public broadcasting, where these films, official Kutlu Doğum Haftası films, were being produced by the Diyanet, and who were then in various ways celebrating the memory of Prophet Muhammad and strongly connecting this to a contemporary sort of religious ethics of how we should be as Turkish young subjects today. I will come back to these films a little bit later. So then, let me focus on these two specific cases, and let's start then with the Topkapi Palace Museum and the Sacred Trusts, which is then the name of the collection of holy relics. I won't go into too much detail about the history and the sort of the various reorganizations that have occurred. I have been writing about this in a couple of articles that you can consult if you're interested later. I would rather like to highlight a number of sort of organizing and disciplinary interventions into museal space and how this then positions the visitor vis-a-vis the objects. And I will look at narrative, ambient, disciplinary, bodily, as well as political aspects of this reorganization, or this series of reorganizations. If we start then with a narrative. So while the objects initially were more or less randomly exhibited within the museum halls, what has happened from 1997 and even more strongly from 2007 is the imposition of a strong thematic narrative within the exposition, where now the visitor enters the museum first encountering the theme of Kaaba, of course then connected to the notion of creation, how Kaaba was sort of connected then to the first altar constructed and built by the first prophet Adam, and how the Kaaba and Mecca provides then, of course, a symbolic center for Islamic faith and imagination. The second theme that you enter into are the prophets, the prophets preceding Prophet Muhammad. Here the theme is monotheism, that all previous prophets have been carrying essentially the same message to mankind, and that there are inherently no differences between the earlier revelations to the prophets and the final prophet as the final revelation as received by Prophet Muhammad. And then the last section is devoted to Prophet Muhammad himself, but also the early Islamic community of Medina and Mecca, and the Rashidun, the four first rightly guided caliphs according to Sunni historiography. This then also suggests that Islam was not only a religious faith being established, but also a distinct political and social order, which is then being celebrated as an ideal social and political form. So among the objects that are sort of highlighted here, we see here, for instance, images and various items and artifacts from the Kaaba. We see here in the back the capsule containing the black stone sitting in the corner of the Kaaba sanctuary, mini Kaaba models. We have drainage pipes and doors and locks to the Kaaba being exposed. In the next section, we have various items from previous prophets. Here we see the turban of Prophet Yusuf. And then we have a number of, in the last section, then the prophet section, the most central object, of course, is the mantle of the prophet himself, being the essential symbol of the divine order initiated in early Islam, but also then objects of sort of the signifying the political order, like the swords of the early caliphs, We have the signet ring that Muhammad carried as a vestige of his prophethood, and that was then carried by the early caliphs. Letters written to the leaders of the world and encourage them to convert to Islam, etc. So the mundane political aspects of early Islamic order are highlighted in this section. So that's a narrative organization. But also, importantly, from then 1997, the Ottoman practice of incessant Quran recitation in the chamber of the holy relics was resumed, and a small box was then installed within the exhibition hall for Imam reciting the Quran. With the 2007 reorganization, the Quran recitation has been amplified as a background sound for the entire museal visit. And now the Imam is sitting on the platform close to the exit of the exhibit, really underscoring that this is not only a quaint soundscape, but this is really the divine revelation for humankind. It's being also projected on plasma screens in Arabic, Turkish, and English. So this completely, of course, changes the museal visit, where you are moving through this space guided by the divine revelation, which, of course, changes the perception and the relation to the objects exposed. Disciplinarily and bodily, there are also a new sort of regulation and organizing of visitors. Firstly, by the entrance, you have a sign saying that you're not supposed to take photographies, and also that you should observe a modest dress code. So you shouldn't have tank tops or bare shoulders entering. So in this sense, it is a bodily disciplinary sort of injunction, not quite dissimilar from what applies for visiting a formal mosque. And also, and perhaps even more importantly, one important objective behind the reorganization in 1997 was the installation of deeper display cases, making it impossible to touch and kiss the display cases, which had been a very common practice before 1997. And this was perceived as a problem by the museum organizers, because this was perceived as rural or non-literal practices that are not according to correct religious behavior. So one should enter the space with modesty and veneration, but not with any sort of religious excesses in practices in relation to the objects. So the objects in this sense are being ambiguously both sacred and mundane. They are vestiges of divine revelation and prophethood and Islamic principles, but they should not be venerated as holy objects themselves. And finally, politically. In one sense, this organization, this narrative, is then also sort of inscribing contemporary Turkey at the end of the spectrum of how then the Islamic tradition was then created for mankind in the dawn of humankind, then revealed to the prophets through the centuries and the millennia, coming up to the final revelation for Prophet Muhammad. It was carried into the Ottoman Caliphate through the claims to the Caliphate by the Ottoman Empire, and then today sort of being revisited in Turkish memory politics as part of the legacy of Turkey. And the uncovering of the Holy Mantle during Ramadan each year has been several times visited by then President, formerly Prime Minister, now President Erdogan, and has been filmed and medialized in several ways. And as we have a small quotation down here in the corner, also in the opening of the 2007 reorganized exhibit, Erdogan emphasized that this is not only this is the house of a living civilization. This is just not only a museum. In this sense, we may think of how sort of Turkey in this religious nationalist discourse is sort of reserving a sort of a caliphal function without any formal, of course, caliph, but yet carrying those types of patronizing or the patronage of the Islamic tradition. So this is a few important cases pertaining to the organization of a formal memory space within the confines of a museum. But as I will argue, this has a strong connection also to what has happened outside of museal space. And an interesting case here is then, as I mentioned, the state-organized Mevlid in the form which was named Kutludom Haftası from already in 1989. But at this time, it was a small affair that didn't stir much either controversy or attention or enthusiasm for that matter. But gradually, during the 1990s, and especially from 2010 onwards, this festival had been distinctly reorganized and rethought, and also attained a much stronger public profile. So what happened, for instance, in 1994, which was a very important turn of the events? Since Kutludom Haftası was organized firstly according to the Hijra calendar, it sometimes came to conflict with Republican celebrations. So in order to avoid this temporal collision, in 1994, the event of Kutludom Haftası, a week's celebrations of Prophet Muhammad, was fixed to the Gregorian calendar. And in so doing, it was then sort of severed from proper Mevlid traditions. And in order to sort of compensate for this, a number of new core rituals were invented, completely invented, for this week of Prophet commemoration, but still were sort of relying on earlier forms and formats for Prophet devotion. So, for instance, there were Mevlid poetry about the Prophet Muhammad being recited in public space during this week. On Gül Günü, the Day of the Rose, political officials were distributing stems of red roses to the public, the rose being the quintessential symbol for Prophet Muhammad. And then during Kutludom Asr, there were this common meal organized in the streets where dignitaries as well as the public were then sharing rice and meat together. From 2010 onwards, the celebrations went through a very distinct expansion and a much more public profile, where then the educational and the celebration in public space was even more strongly emphasized. Huge rallies were organized for school youth, especially for high schools in Imam Hatip schools, with the celebrations and Quran recitations and various student arts and crafts being presented in massive events in sports stadiums. It was also regulated centrally by the Diyanat, but then came to be diversified in local organizations that sometimes tended to go a little bit over the top. So here we have, for instance, a case where hot air balloons were being raised into the air, and then stems of red roses were being thrown out from the balloons while hymns to the glory of the Prophet were being recited. Most importantly, however, was the educational side, where in thousands, schools were then organizing events and educational happenings during this week, with Quran recitations by children, with various type of then expositions like mini museums being created within the school space, and also these films produced by the Diyanat were being broadcast in public television, as well as in various forms on social media. And just to give you a little bit sort of a taste of these films and their character, let me give you a very brief sample from 2013. Now, please excuse that the sound will be very poor since I'm doing this through my computer.
Allah'ın elçisi geldi. Hazreti Muhammed geldi. İslam geldi.
Looks like your connection froze, Torsten. If you can hear me, I'm not sure.
I think Torsten is frozen altogether.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, yes.
He demanded too much from his laptop.
You did mention that the connection on campus wasn't always the best. So maybe the video was too much for it. Let's wait. It should come back.
Yeah. Yeah, we're recording now.
Okay, thank you so much. And please excuse this debacle. Another example of failing material culture. Let's...
We can't see your screen yet. I guess you're working on that.
Right. You have disabled the screen sharing, so can you please...
All right, okay. Yeah. Now you should be able to do it.
Okay. Right. So, what was the last thing you heard from me? Did I come to the film?
No, we had 10 seconds of the film, basically. I mean, yeah, we saw the first 10 seconds.
Well, it's not much longer than that, but let's resume from there. We should have on speaker view like this, right? Okay. So let's resume the film, and I will take down the volume a bit. Okay, here we go.
Allah'ın elçisi geldi. Hazreti Muhammed geldi. İslam geldi. Rahmet geldi. Adem'in çocuklarısınız dedi. Havva'nın çocuklarısınız. Birbirinizin hukukunu çiğnemeyin dedi.
So I think this gives you an idea of how there's constant references to symbolics to Islam and the Prophet Muhammad, alternated with inclusions of children and how contemporary children are the heirs of the same faith tradition, etc., etc. Various personages of the sacred tradition are being incurred, and also there are a lot of appeals to contemporary society and what is then seen as the calamities and difficulties of contemporary society with greed, conflicts, natural disasters, etc., etc. So it's a very strong ethic message being then produced with a constant reference then to Prophet Muhammad as an ethical more than religious precedence. The expositions also were then very central, and museum space were a central space in where then the Kutludoğum Haftası was being celebrated. And as I mentioned before, a number of then Hilye Sharif shows were being organized during from 2010 and onwards, and then in 2016 it was the Hilye Sharif was devoted their own museum. And the tradition, the Ottomans, distinctly Turkish Ottoman tradition of Hilya Sharif was emphasized, but also how this is a living tradition, and newly produced and more experimental forms of Hilya Sharif has also been part of these shows. And just to give you a couple of the little bit more, let's call them radical examples of this, is here we have on the green one being sort of the interior of a Kaaba, which is dressed on the inside by the 99 glorious names of Allah, and then we have the description of Prophet Muhammad sort of in the bottom of the well or the end of the tunnel here. And then we have here also even the Turkish flag being used as a carrier for Hilya, where then the hadith texts quoting Caliph Ali, his testimony about Prophet Muhammad is being quoted. So in this sense, it's a rethinking of the Hilya Sharif tradition in a contemporary format, so they are perhaps the most really inventive forms that we see here. It's more common that you're following the sort of the classic design of the Hilya Sharif tradition. But then we have various types of then expositions also using public space, as I mentioned early on with the theme park of Üsküdar. Lately, from 2017 particularly onwards, with the increasing success and the increasing publicization of the Kutlu-Doğum Haftası celebration, it also started to incur more critique. It had constantly been critiqued from a secularist perspective, as I mentioned, as an incursion of the secular publics with religious symbolism. But now also a more internal religious critique started to be voiced, where allegations of religious innovations, the anathema of bid'ah, was being incurred, saying that, is this not really some sort of quasi-Christmas being celebrated where we are commemorating the birth of the Prophet Muhammad? Isn't it bizarre to celebrate the birth of Muhammad twice per year, and where we have the traditional form of Mevlid on the one hand, and also this quasi and state-organized Mevlid form? And I think it was exactly those sort of various examples of exaggerated and local enthusiasm that went sometimes over the top, and a number of controversies like the mini Kaaba, and we have the cake shaped in the form of the Quran by students of a Quran study seminar that started a formal or gave sort of initiated a formal investigation by the Diyanat. So these constant or this tendency to exaggeration led to that the director of the Diyanat was being sacked and replaced with a new one in 2017, which then also led to the immediate sort of scrapping of the entire concept of Kutlu-Doğum Haftası and relaunching it as Mevlidi Nebi, the birth of the Prophet, which is running to the present. So what this then signifies, I would argue, is that it's a form of a rebounding of Mevlid, where still the public aspects and the educational value of Mevlid is being embraced, but then the most exaggerated public forms are being more strongly regulated, and it's a tendency to sort of go back to then museal spaces and other established forms for celebrating a Mevlid, where then the traditional Turkish forms of Mevlid celebration is being then reincorporated within the schools. In the schools, not much happens when it comes to the celebration. It's basically the same format, but now it's being then in one sense connected to a more orthodox type of celebration, with the reservation, of course, that Mevlid is not any formal religious duty according to Islamic principles. So then here we have the tendency also then, as I would argue, to go back to the museal space, for instance, of Topkapi and using the shows of the holy relics being then disseminated throughout the nation as one way of both keeping the Mevlid themes alive and still have a strong public profile without then using these strongly inventive forms of celebrations. Historic sacred institutions are in various ways re-emphasized, and I would suggest that the resacralization and the formal mosquification or re-mosquification of Hagia Sophia has to be understood exactly in this context, where the formal religious institutions are having a stronger emphasis, and which is then again being reconnected or even strongly connected to the celebration of Istanbul as the essential site and nucleus of Islamic memory, of course highlighted with a yearly ever more greatly and conspicuously celebrated celebrations of May 29th and the conquest of the city. Here, as we see it, directly connected to Hagia Sophia in the 2000, and if I remember correctly, the 2019 celebrations. And then still retained in educational space, where I would argue that there is basically the same phenomenology of the Hilya Sharif is being reenacted in sort of pedagogically adjusted forms, where installations and portraits, so to speak, of the Prophet Muhammad is being constructed all through educational spaces during the Mevlid week. With here we see an installation incurring the memory of Prophet Muhammad as the Lord of the Roses, as we see here in the text over the blackboard. We see the Rihal, the Quran stand, strewn in front of it are leaves from roses, which is then of course referring to Prophet Muhammad, and the candles around them signifying the divine light. Taking up very strong traditions from Mevlid traditions, where Prophet Muhammad is seen as this juncture of the divine and the human, where the human is the red, the rose, the heart, whereas the light, the candle, is symbolizing the divine revelation. And we see, I could spend an hour talking about this blackboard because it contains so many references, so many legendary as well as orthodox practices that are central. So they are extremely, I would say, creative and rich expositions, but then of course also a strongly disciplinary type of educational activities confined then to celebrating a religious principle in an purportedly secular educational system. We see shows of various types of exactly these student crafts, and I would like to find, as just a very last example, give you another short video taken from an Imam Hatip school during the celebrations of Mevlid Nabi in 2019, where students are displaying their crafts. Here we see the Battle of Badr, the first decisive battle in early Islamic history. The year of the Battle of the Elephant, which was the birth year of Prophet Muhammad, mentioned in the Quran, and the climax of the show speaks for itself. And please don't ask me why Für Elise is the chosen music for this. Let me instead suggest a couple of concluding analytical perspectives, what I feel that we can draw out from these examples. First of all, I suggest then that museal exhibits should be thought of as specializations of then a contesting Turkish Islamic Republican nationalism. So the spatial aspects of these events and imaginations, I think, are essential in sort of framing what is going on, connected to temporal imaginations, of course. This is then co-occurring with various types of public, ritual, strongly affective, and educational memory productions, which is then in its turn also carefully navigating theological sensitivities and boundary drawings. And I think while there has been quite a lot of work devoted to the various types of so-called neo-Ottomanism, but there has been very little academic work done on how the new forms, the inventive forms of religion that we see in Turkey today, and not only in Turkey, is also provocative for some, is also sort of a kitschification, and that could be seen as a trivialization of religious traditions. So I think the theological sensitivities and the reactions that have come in later years are parts of an attempt actually to reclaim religion in a sense, going back to orthopraxy and stronger sort of established traditional ideas, whereas being sort of enthusiastic about the stronger emphasis of religion, no doubt, but still starting to police the borders of these new practices. So what I suggest that this theoretically also gives an interesting opportunity, I would say, is that it suggests that we can also, I think, re-theorize the very dynamics of the religious and the political, and go beyond conceptions like Islamism, political Islam, which I feel are suffering from loads of problems theoretically, by rather looking at then this, I would call them the interface of religion and politics in its symbolic forms. I think that is a more fruitful way of approaching what is going on in the name of politics, Islam, in the world today. So looking beyond formal politics, beyond formal movements like the Muslim Brotherhood and Hezbollah, etc., but rather look at what actually happens in space, in temporal imaginations, how are effective aspects of devotion being sort of read into the various, the emphasis of religion in politics. Which then methodologically means that we rather should, or at least also explore the cultural hegemonic dimensions, looking at cultural production, looking at ritual, looking at spatial production, temporal aspects, and not least the affective aspects of religion and politics in Turkey today, as well as beyond Turkey in the entire Muslim world and diasporic communities. So with that, I want to, I think I should stop talking. I'll be excited to take your comments and questions. Let me just highlight a couple of articles that have come out from these efforts. And let me also emphasize Neşe Kinikolu, who I've been working with for several years, together with her exploring these aspects. And she did her PhD in the University of Edinburgh, looking at Topkapi Palace Museum and Untitled as orchestrations of the state. And we have written one piece together, and Neşe also recently published an article in the Southeast and European Black Sea Studies journal, and also forthcoming is a chapter in the book I mentioned early on under the editorship of Katarina Rodver. So with that, thank you so much for your attention, and I'd be happy to take your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Torsten. It was a very enlightening and interesting talk. I would like to open the floor. Well, yeah, Aishoja, please go ahead.
Could you please remove the PowerPoint?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you so much, Torsten. It's been always a pleasure to listen to you, and it was really very good to see all these stunning examples and images that underline your points very well. But before going into the discussion and question and answer section, I'd like to underline one point that I'm sure you are very well aware of it, that this Kutlu Doğum Haftası has always been associated with Fethullah Gülen community. It's been one of the invention of that community, and they were quite active in implementing and introducing this and making it, integrating it as a part of this Islamic politics of the AKP as well. And then, as you, I'm sure, know very well, just after 2015, after this, unsuccessful coup attempt, then this transformed into Mevlid-i Nebi. Maybe you would like to elaborate on it a little bit more, and then, therefore, it will show us a very important point about to what extent these, political battles in religious symbols, or just maybe we can call it symbolic battles over religious rituals and sacralization of all these whether secular or religious symbols and so on. And that's also an important point, and it would be good to emphasize to underline this point, to be able to see the both the ruptures and the continuity of those the invention and implementation of these rituals. What would you say about it?
No, I completely agree, and it's a very important point, and it's good that you brought that up. So I think the post coup environment is really what I was trying to get at towards the end of the talk, also how there is an internal competition going on, and that one should be very careful, of course, to think about the religious community as a homogeneous body. Of course, there are multiple interests and stakes here, and not least we have what I'm quite interested in pursuing also for the future is this very strong Sufi element of the Mevlid, of course. I mean, being the prophet devotion, which is being in the center for that, and then how that does not the Sufi, at least the Sufi form, of course, doesn't really fall into the orthodox principles of the Diyanat, etc. So there is this tension here, a very distinct tension, and I think in the early days you were able to sort of let me say exploit the religious tradition for political purposes with impunity, because it was new, it was a way of referring to a common ancestry, etc. But once the sort of the various positions and the polemics within the political religious community becomes sharper, then also it becomes a stronger awareness and competition of exactly what types of values and symbols are we using here. And I have been quite fascinated to see, because I've been looking in detail in the production then on the Hilya Sharif arc, that there are very strong Sufi themes sometimes present on the one hand. On the other hand, which I argue in this recent article that I'm working on now, is that the most appreciated pieces, the award-winning panels that are being promoted, they are very traditional, and they're emphasizing sort of an orthodox view of Prophet Muhammad, where the sort of mysterious, mystical themes are being de-emphasized, and they are, excuse the formulation, they are littered with Quran quotation. So the Hilya Sharif, which used to be a very sort of iconic representation of Prophet Muhammad, tends to be more an iconic depiction of Quran. And I think this is a very interesting sort of literalization and textualization of a visual art tradition that is part of exactly this tug of war the symbolic politics that you are mentioning.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from anyone in the room? Yeah, Umut, please.
Hello. First of all, thank you, Professor Janson, for your presentation. Actually, I was planning to ask a question about changing the status of Hagia Sophia from museum to mosque, but you already mentioned, and my question was to be about if it was a spontaneous or an improvised political movement to domestic politics, or it was part of a master plan. And now I am reversing my question that do you think all these museal changes and everything you talked about are an aggregation of spontaneous acts, or are they parts of a master plan, a big master plan?
It's an interesting question. I think this is partly, I think it partly is a theoretical question about how does cultural inventions occur. And I have my basic understanding of cultural change from a very hegemonic perspective, meaning that I see it as the sum effect of a multiple of trajectories and discourses and capacities and resources that are being finding various junctures at various points. I'm very influenced by theories like, for instance, like Appadurai here, in thinking of how difference is being construed through culture in a sometimes very sort of plastic and almost random way. So to the extent that there is a master plan, which I mean, clearly in one sense, there is a master plan when it comes to forwarding the memory of the Ottoman past and the Islamic sort of legacies. Of course, we see that within it would be silly to deny that there is that overt political objective connected to the Islamic movements, political Islamic movements in Turkey, and has been for decades, as we know. But I would then say that even if such a plan would exist, it doesn't really explain the actual surfacing materially and empirically, because that is the effect of a number of like coincidences, serendipities, contemporary sort of coincidental sort of opportunities which is emerging. So if we again go back to the Hilya Sharif art, it strongly relies on private collectors who have been patronizing this art for a long time, who then draw the attention of President Erdogan, who in his turn then started to take an interest for this art. So it was partly connected to Erdogan's personal interest in this art tradition, partly then connected to the work that has been done within then, well, a faith community interested in Islamic arts, that then surface when it becomes institutionalized and bureaucratized into the establishment of a new museum in 2016. So I would say there are multiple trajectories sort of working together in order to produce visual culture and memory culture. So I wouldn't sort of, I would like rather than not to think of the question of the master plan or the sort of spontaneous events as any necessary dichotomous thing. I think they can be quite complementary. I hope that somewhat answers your question. But this is a big question, and I'm sure that many of you have thoughts about this.
Thank you. Margaret Ojo, it's good to see you here after we exchanged via email.
Yeah, thanks very much. And thank you very much indeed, Torsten, for a really fascinating and very clear talk. Thank you so much. I'd like to ask a question about the museum organization itself, not spatial organization, but as an institution that requires many visitors. And of course, many of those visitors would actually be put off both by the nationalistic aspects and by the Islamification of those narratives that you're talking about. I wondered whether we have any information about the any sort of counterbalancing exhibits, exhibitions, or publicity that Topkapi itself, which of course contains other collections, and also other museums in Istanbul, to try to counterbalance what would be off-putting for many international tourism, because I believe that, I'm not quite sure about the economics of this, but I think that international tourism is still economically very important here. It's not just internal tourism. And of course, a lot of internal tourists could be put off by this as well, although that would be a hidden critique. So is there any physical exhibition space counterbalancing that goes on to try to still appeal to visitors who might not be interested in the messages of this thing?
Again, a super interesting perspective and question. I wish that Neshe could be here today, because she would be in a better position to answer this. She did in her PhD, she did also looking into the museum organization to the extent that that was sort of available as evidence, because this is also politically sensitive questions, of course. But what is quite evident is that there has been a strong internal discussion within the museum staff, where an older cadre of them, secularly oriented museum staff, have been emphasizing the artifacts as historic artifacts, as not really interested in any sort of sacred status in any sense, whereas a younger section of the crew have been more than inclined to emphasize the sacred collection. And as of lately, it has the latter has then have a somewhat upper hand, I think, than patronized by broader political tendencies, right?
Yes.
The question then, whether there are, to the extent, I have no idea how this is being received by the international audience, and if people are being put off by it, more than I have discovered through my own sort of my fieldwork visits in numerous locations in the premises. And if you allow me to take a very impressionist stance here, that would be that the Islamization feeds into a broader Orientalist discourse that fits very well with many museum visitors who wants to see, like, going to basically 1000 a night world, experience of Istanbul. So in that sense, maybe, but this is speculation, it doesn't really hurt, this constituency. Please take it as a speculation. What also can be mentioned is that if we look, for instance, at the Panorama History Museum, which is then commemorating the Battle of Istanbul and the conquest of Istanbul, that museum by visitors is completely patronized by people who are already favorable to this historiography and who tend to be politically following sort of an AKP universe. There is a very important new book about this by Güne Busulu. It's called Museum, Emotion and Memory Culture. It was published in 2020, and she's the first one who looks at this museum also from a visitor's perspective. So I really recommend you to take a look at that one. But that's sort of an example of that the museum spaces themselves are becoming a little bit polemical, that you have a certain constituency that tends to patronize and visit museums when it comes to the Turkish audiences. But then you have the mid-zone, which I think is very fascinating, and that's the school audiences, because it's hugely popular among school audiences. Of course, then with the level of criticality would be, maybe not so great, and more in the hands of the school teachers. So in that sense, I think the big school audiences who are rushing through the sort of the secular presentation of the history of the conquest and just want to experience, you know, the theatrical orchestration of the conquest, they are then forming a you know, what are the effects of a school audiences being enthusiastic about a museum show? We don't know. I mean, the entire field of museum ethnography is very weak. Generally, we know very little about visiting experiences, especially among children and youth. So one can only speculate. But then the question whether there are other sort of museal spaces counterbalancing this, well, I think I don't really have a good answer to that. To some extent, the more traditional, like the archaeology museum, has been so far less inclined to the sacralization, but they also have hosted now exhibits of the sacred relics, for instance. So I think there has been a tendency also to reach out and sacralize also these spaces. But I think this is really an empirical question that needs to be pursued in further research, how the various museums actually are being run and directed.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that what's happened at the Untitled museum here in Ankara has been interesting. About 15 to 20 years ago, there was a very, very overt material renationalization. I mean, you'd have thought it would be hard to make it more nationalistic, but it was rehistoricized visually with displays evidently aimed mostly at school children. That was it was so extreme that actually I used to bring my foreign visitors always to Anıt Kabir as a very impressive monument of respect that also documented Republican ideals and such like that. And I stopped going because I found the shrieking nationalism too extreme, and my visitors were made very uncomfortable. So sort of that was not from an Islamicization point of view, but from a different interpretation of how history should be represented in museum spaces. And I just wished, I just wondered about people who are designing museum spaces here in Turkey when they have presumably some sort of directive to go in one direction or another. How can they manage to counterbalance? How can they manage to, and sometimes not, obviously. Thank you for your answer.
Mm-hmm. But let me very briefly comment back. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we need to think of this as partly as time in terms of a nationalizing quest, with, in this case, as I touched on today, with some sort of religious flavor to it. But I would assume that over the broader trajectory would be the nationalist one, and how the religiosization sort of feeds into that, while also interestingly being then in some sort of polemic with that secularist nationalist space. Because as I understand it, Anıt Kabir also has become more important in secularist memory as like a sort of counter positioned vis-a-vis, say Topkapi.
Yes, maybe. Yes, indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. İlkaz, it's your turn.
Yeah, thank you. First, can I leave my camera off because I'm in dormitory?
No problem at all.
Okay, thank you. My comment was going to be about, well, it's not that interesting, but I was going to comment from my own experience. I graduated high school in 2016, so I have seen the Kutlu Doğum Haftası, those weeks, holy birth weeks. And what I found interesting was in your presentation, there were these decorations, there were these exhibitions in the schools. But in my school, the most happened was just they will take us for just 1 hour of the class and put us in a seminar room and show a video, and then we would go back to our class and continue whatever class we were doing at that moment. And I find it interesting because it seems like education appears to be one of the most political part at the play when it comes to this Holy Birth Week, because your examples were from Imam Hatip schools, which are mostly known as the more religious schools, or the schools locations were from cities which are known as more religious cities. And I wasn't from a religious city, mostly. Most people lived in there were known as secular. So I found this interesting.
I would strongly claim that this is far from not an interesting comment. I think this is an extremely important comment that you're making. There's always a huge risk when I do a presentation like this that it's like cherry picking, right? That you're picking examples that can be more graphic and more illustrative of a point that you want to make. And of course, I'm guilty of that in this presentation. And I think what you are saying is so important because it really underscores two things: that how school children were being, exactly as you say, just thrown into this without any like creativity or enthusiasm, but also then not through a broader disciplinary apparatus, making this a more or less insignificant event. So that's extremely important to remember. Let's remember that the Kurtulum Haftase was being introduced in formal curriculum. So high schools had to comply to this if you didn't want to, of course, deviate from the regulations. And then I think very many schools paid, as you say, lip service to this practice. But it's an extremely important point that you're making.
Thank you. Sibel?
Oh, thank you. And thank you, Professor, for being with us today and also reminding us our hyper-reality, or let's say our dystopia today. And I have two questions, two theoretical questions, actually. One is regarding the conceptualization of your museal space. With reference to Donna Haraway, her conceptualization of enterprising up of nature, can we say that this is the enterprising up of religion or the ritual? In the sense that you are just show us that these spaces, these sacred spaces are for market, or actually not market, but they are displayed, and this displacement display is something more related to the reification process. So can we say that this is a museal reification, maybe, like turning space into museums? And my second question is is it you showed us a visual on Kabe in Üsküdar, and is it a copy or a subject constitution, like a new thing, as a new space of the ritual? I'm actually questioning the relationship between the original and the copy, and these are two questions that brought to my mind. Thank you.
Thank you so much. They are both very refreshing and interesting questions. And I completely agree where, I mean, your reference to Harvey, I think it's highly relevant, and how the reification aspect of this, of course, is what really strikes you as perhaps the most pertinent one in the conscious construction of a unified visual universe pertaining to some an indistinct Islamic or Ottoman past, superimposed on contemporary architecture and practice. So in that sense, I think reification is the very subject, the very sort of overall intention which is going on here. Harvey, I think I need to think more about that. It's a good, very interesting lead. Connected to this, may I throw in something else which I'm very sort of influenced here? It's Timothy Mitchell's, and Timothy Mitchell's theorization of colonialism, and when he has been studying the early world exhibitions and during colonialism. So he was looking at, for instance, world expositions in Paris and in Stockholm, how then the Orient was being reconstructed in Paris and in Stockholm, and making the point that the actual domination of the colonized world went hand in hand with a visual representation of that colonized world as a lacking, traditionalist, non-developed realm. So entire streets, so-called streets from so-called Cairo, was being constructed in Paris with donkeys and fighting pedestrians included. So it was a complete spectacle which was extremely then Orientalist and traditionalist, as a way of depicting France as the caretaker of civilization and modernity, of course, justifying colonialization. I think something similar is really going on in Turkey today, where sort of, and his point here, let me just say that, on the one hand, he says that Mitchell is using the concept of the world exhibition, which is taking place in Paris. That goes hand in hand with his formulation, the world as exhibition. So there is a representational practice which goes hand in hand with the actual political practice in the actual Middle East. I think it's a very similar thing goes on in Turkey, where then a new type of politics, which is, of course, as we know, neoliberal, socio-conservative, etc., then goes hand in hand with a representation of space, which is becoming also the world as exhibition, but world as an Islamic exhibition. So I think that the primary function of them, the exhibitions, is really, what Lefebvre called, the representation of space, in how space is being rendered as a narrative which goes hand in hand with the actual spatial politics in economics, education, law, and etc. Right? So in that sense, I think that the Harvey idea of sort of how the internal and external is connected in museum space, I think that's very promising. And I think this really touches on your second question also, which I think is really nice. Claiming that it wouldn't be anything else than a completely artificial, not even copy, but a replica, would be highly, unorthodox. To say that this is sort of actual Kaaba, how a Kaaba actually looks, would be very against the grain of orthodox ideas, because there is only one Kaaba, there is only one pilgrimage. Kaaba is the center of the world, quite literally, as in the prayer direction, etc., meaning that, of course, it cannot be copied. There is no such thing as a copy, as little as Quran can be rendered into a book. The Quran is the living recitation of God, basically, right? So I think it's, in that sense, it's exactly the more similar to reality you become by creating this type of religious, can I call it kitsch, the more problematical it becomes theologically. So in that sense, I think it's very important for the curators and initiators of these religious shows to really be marking off that this is not reality, this is not the real. And still, since it's pedagogically so functional, we see how school children in thousands are making mini Kaaba after mini Kaaba after mini Kaaba. So I think it's a very interesting, ambiguous, and exactly hyper-real practice that we are seeing, which it doesn't really make sense. It doesn't hold up to theological scrutiny, and I think this is exactly why the various types of critiques and conflicts are surfacing in the wake of these attempts to popularize religion.
All right, thank you. Barış, Hocam, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Torsten. Well, actually, it's not maybe a question, but food for thought, and totally related to what you just said, actually, like through like Mitchell and stuff, more questions of this power, how through museums it operates, I mean, at least with this analogy. So I was like thinking the contrast between this museal space and non-museal spaces were quite striking, actually. And like you are saying as well, I mean, how it is like trivialized, kitschyfied, like in these spaces, in these non-museal spaces as well. I was like thinking, especially when you give the example from the like Topkapi Palace, how that discipline works there, the ambience you are talking about, the narrative and stuff, how it produces a certain body, the visitor and space, like throughout the whole that performance. But the schools and like the other like non-museal like spaces were totally exactly how you said, like through Mitchell, there the problem was like producing the order, I mean, in the effect of order. There you see like bringing up all different these images of the popular culture, like how we call kitchification and like so forth. It is like producing a totally contrast actually there. So I felt like it is another mechanism of power working there. So, I mean, it is like sacralization on the one hand, maybe we can call it profanization, profanization, if there is such a word. So it is interesting to produce like religious through this profanization as well. I mean, like the signs were very like amazing. I mean, like it was writing like Güllerin Efendisi, like Lord of the Rings, like image, the way the like candles were like produced there, like totally like this like popular, I mean, probably received from the popular culture in different ways and like placed there. So like rather than producing this generally what is expected, this unity of the order and stuff, more the like chaotic, I mean, all those like different ceremonies, what you showed like through the videos as well, or like this using the cakes as the crown and stuff. I mean, it is like, or like almost like sin, I felt like. I mean, how do they do this? I mean, like you talked about the reactions as well afterwards, but I mean, in the end, this is also going along simultaneously, like with the other one. So like, should we think another like power regime here at the same time happening? Because I mean, I'm able to understand very easily that sacralization, but how this effect, I mean, can we expect the same effect of the sacralization while it is working simultaneously as profanization? I mean, I can understand the expansion of these images and stuff as much as to the like schools and stuff, but I think it is not only producing another effect, it also operates in a different way. So maybe we need another like conceptual tools or something to make sense of this like interesting like phenomenon. I don't know. I mean, your thoughts about it, maybe.
I cannot but, you know, agree with your reflections and sort of, I don't have any answer. I think what you're asking is extremely relevant. And I think that perhaps if we should be very careful to make like historical parallels, but I think it can be worthwhile to also think back on the transformation of Christian culture in Europe or in the US, etc., right? And how evidently there has been a mundane aspect of the religion which has overtaken commercial aspect, which has overtaken like Christianity and Christmas and etc., etc. And I think that the question would be, and what makes this scenario so interesting is that this is the Diyanet evidently, for instance, as one player here, is trying to run this show, so to speak. And I think it is an unattainable task. I would be on the behalf of Diyanet sort of pessimist to the extent that you can control what goes on in the name of culture when culture appropriates the sacred, because I think I feel that culture is expansive, right? It finds its own paths, its own ways. It's a question of what appeals to audiences, what works pedagogically, etc., etc. And I think in one sense, you know, that the history of theology in any religious tradition has been a tradition of what works. Things that doesn't work in societies tend to be historically sorted out of theologies eventually. But right now we have evidently one political force who has a strong agenda to attain something, and sort of, I think, tries out a number of venues and arenas for that, and sometimes get, you know, hit back, get sort of a little bit, get these unexpected results from the initiatives that are being taken. And I think that, you know, cultural processes are so non-programmable. They are so often surprising and creative in their own ways. So culture simply cannot be directed from above. And I think this is what's, you know, the Diyanet's pedagogical problem today. And the question is, how will they react to this institutionally? I think the first institutional reaction has been to a little bit retract their steps into safe zones of orthodoxy, into safe zones of positive history, and et cetera, et cetera. At least that's the hypothesis I've been following. But I think this is really something that we need to follow up on and see what transpires quite empirically. And I would be amazed to see research done, for instance, by school children actually experiencing those mechanisms and those museum visits and etc. I think this is an empirical question, and something that lies ahead of us is also theoretical questions in how we are thinking about change and religious disciplinization of culture. Not much of a question, I'm well aware, but I just want to, you know, feed into your general reflections.
Exactly, just like I was like thinking, I'm sorry, John. Like the interesting thing was in those like school meetings, that effect that is produced in the museums was not even tried, and it was just left over. That's what was interesting. And for example, more the secular rituals in the schools, I remember the effect was still more produced. I mean, like there was a previous question. I was more like she was saying she was more raised in secular schools and stuff. So here it's a like different thing. Probably some other like factors are playing role. I mean, not only like producing religious boundaries, but I mean some like class issues or like different like factors should be included, because I don't think this is just like can be fall totally into a category of like resistance or like the way Bambara reads. I mean, in each mimicry, there are some, of course, like there are some like variations, heterogeneities going on, but this is totally contrast, I felt like. That's why it was very interesting. So like, thank you very much for that.
And also, I mean, let's consider a class of 30 pupils. There are 30 different positions here, 30 different like positionalities and subjectivities that are in play. Someone may be amazed and secretly, you know, still romanticizing, you know, the historical devotional, you know, aspects. Some will be, you know, thinking of their girlfriend or boyfriend, right? So we also really should be extremely careful in saying anything what goes on in schools from a student's perspective, of course.
Thank you. Aishoja, please.
Yeah, let me start from the last discussion, though I have another point. But yeah, I completely agree with both of you, but still, I'm sure you both will never forget that there is an economic politics behind it. I mean, this is a state policy. I mean, this reimposition of and reimagining of re-specialization of religious symbols and re-institutionalization of those symbols and all rituals and secularization and everything is a state policy, and it constitutes a very strong culture politics, and there is a culture market over there. Of course, they are all blended with the popular culture. There are lots of reconciliations over there, and we cannot, know from now how it will happen, how we will end up with all these. But still, there is a big money behind it. I mean, without social scientization, I'm saying that economic politics, there is money behind it, all right? And we shouldn't forget that point as well. And my point, I was just wanted to drop a note on the Margaret Hoca's point about this counterbalancing rituals. Though my example would not be from about the organization and functioning of museums, but that reminded me the secular reappropriation of the Ottoman history. All right. Then ever since these, big municipalities have changed hands, and then now they are running by secular mayors, and as we all know, then I'm sure you know about this, commemoration about the conquerance of Istanbul, not Constantinople, we never mention it, but Istanbul, and then the Fatih Sultan Mehmet, all right? And there is an obvious reappropriation over there by, for instance, Ekrem İmamoğlu, now the Istanbul's mayor, right? They are just trying to, maybe you had some chance to observe it or watch maybe the YouTube videos and so on and so forth. They were just, trying to, as I've said, reappropriate all these, commemorations by, introducing new, much more nature-friendly type of, celebrations, such as, getting rid of those, real fireworks, but laser fireworks, and, new kind of lightnings, and new kind of, orchestrated music. And I'm sure most of you have seen it. And it had been, celebrated full-heartedly by people, and from, let me say, both sides. And but I'm sure you have read Alev Çınar's book. She's the one who first wrote about these commemorations and how they had been invented during Necmettin Erbakan's time, all right, and how they had been sacralized, all these commemorations. But now this nationalistic or a kind of, neo-Ottomanism is on the pipe, I'm afraid, all right, pipeline, I mean. Anyway, there are those, there will be always such kind of counterbalancings, but it depends on the, power constellations, right? Okay, that was my just, comment to remind some points. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very quickly, of course, let's not forget the state apparatus and the power, the muscle, which is involved here. Absolutely not. It's I think sometimes I want to nuance myself in not exaggerating the actual significance of this, because it sometimes be easy to do that. But then you can just as easily go in the other direction too far and to say that this is just any sort of a popular cultural decentralized disjuncture a la Apadurai. Of course it's not. And of course, Apadurai also has a very keen eye on what goes on in state politics. So most definitely, this scape feeds into other scapes if we want to keep with stay with Arjun. Then the interesting example of what goes on then, to the extent that there is a counter positioning, counter construction of the Istanbul celebrations. I mean, in some extent, there are still sort of confusingly similar, in several cases. I don't know if so much
nationalistic cases, but not in religious cases, right?
Right.
But, yeah, reinterpretation of religion is on the way as well. You're right at that point.
I think it would be super interesting to try to sift through this and see the various layers, right? Because there's a political narrative about it and saying this is what it really means. Why? So that's one thing. And then it's the performative perspective. How is this being orchestrated through fireworks and what music is being played, etc. That's another layer. And then how is this being perceived by, in spatial practices by individuals as the next layer, etc., etc. So I think this is, it's hard to say anything conclusive about this before one tries to sift through these various layers. But I think it's extremely important to keep them in mind and not suggest that there is one neo-Ottomanization going on, but how this is being, again, also between contesting positions and contesting political agendas, etc.
One more point with your permission, Antoine, and maybe you have also had that chance to watch the opening ceremony of Atatürk Kültür Merkezi. If you didn't, please do, and just watch that new opera.
Yes. Yes.
Ordered by the president. It was really very interesting with all the scene and everything. All right, it was. There are a handful of Turkish opera from beginning to end, and then you should watch it. All right.
This is really. It's so fun that you mentioned this because I have really had my eyes on this for a while, and then also what I would like to do in the book that might materialize someday about this is then also to look at sort of the inter-regional connections.
Yes.
And how this then, how Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan is sort of feeding into this and being also orchestrated, a new Turkishness, which is somehow connected to the religious and historical narratives in a very bizarre way. And just the placement of the Merkezi, just adjacent to the Panorama Museum, I think that says a lot of how these narrative heterotopic spaces are being also physically interconnected in a fascinating way. So this is something I'm really thinking about. But you're absolutely right. It's a fascinating material which I'm just dying to dig into. Hopefully properly in the next couple of
years. As you said, this is just a peg-o board. That I like that expression as well very much. And then the counterbalancing, and then now we have an opera ordered by the President Erdogan himself. Right.
Thank you.
Margaret Hoca, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much again. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. This is more of a statement, but I found this very inspiring. Thank you. I'd like to refer back to the assumption that I think we probably all hold, which is, as Torsten mentioned, you cannot regulate culture from above. You cannot control culture from above. And relating this to museological practices, where since the 1970s, the concept of what was then called new museology or the eco-museum took hold, which was very much related to social practices in museology. And of course, it couldn't really thrive because it was organizational and economic as well. It required the whole organization of museums to come from below, from community practice. Now, my stance on this comes from museums of language, and especially museums whose overt and covert, well, especially overt message is the safeguarding of endangered languages and the use of museums and school programs and festivals and exhibitions to safeguard certain selected languages on the UNESCO list and not other languages. So what I find here when I look at the history of the use of museal space for one way or another, cultural and political, inextricably cultural and political programs, is that we have a sliding scale of standardization. And I think that this is the conflict that this creates within what seems to be a unified policy. Is beautifully illustrated in Torsten's picture of the exhibits in their distanced exhibit case and the signpost that encourages visitors not to practice rural practices. But in fact, this rural practice of venerating objects, kissing the display cases or the tombs of local saints, which is being discouraged, is precisely the Islamic culture from below that would give these programs the popular force that they need. So in standardizing the way that museum spaces can be used by the people and not allowing them to use it in the way that the people would almost instinctively use it coming from their own culture, they're actually stopping the very thing that they want to do. So I just thought that was quite interesting. It brings together the difficulty that we have. So when organizations like UNESCO in languages organizes programs for using museal space and various festivals and performative and educational programs, traveling exhibitions, etc. It was the Endangered Languages Year a couple of years ago, and there were a lot of these exhibitions and conferences and seminars and educational things for endangered, but they selected which languages, which types of languages, and it was always from above. So the people who were the very few remaining users and speakers of these languages were still not only being patronized, but the very important contributions they had to make about how this could effectively be promoted were totally ignored. And in fact, this is something that has been written about since a long time. But I just thought it all came together so beautifully in that image of not to use rural practices. In other words, you know, we're going to impose upon you a new way of enculturating your nationalistic aspects of the religion, but we're not going to accept those very strong traditions which already exist and that actually they should be accepting. And this is exactly the same with what we're finding with language museums. You know, there's a tendency to try to reify literally and promote and talk about the standard. And if within that they want to promote certain, for example, dialects or so-called endangered languages or minority languages, they're still selecting only certain acceptable forms of minority language, and there's still a sliding scale of standardization and acceptability. And those things which become represented in official displays of culture have almost nothing to do with the reality of culture from below. That's my comment, and I thank you for listening to me.
No, thank you. It's fascinating. So I mean, of course, culture cannot be dictated from above, but that doesn't mean that people are bloody well trying, right? And with significant harm involved in that. So I completely agree, and I think that the concept of the new museology is extremely interesting. I'm trying to revisit that in my new publication about this, and then looking at how then museal practices in Istanbul selectively have chosen from the basket of new museology, where certain things appeal, like the theatricalness, the sensory sort of mechanisms involving communities, blah blah blah. You know, these things are being embraced, but then they are also then you know, involving the community can be also very selective, that a certain community with certain religious ID superimpose their standards on the type of display which is being made. So it's a very bizarre combination of some ambitions to involve the so-called community and being still very, you know, formulating this from above. It's still a very, you know, representational space, very much superimposed by curators and museum staff.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We're slowly running out of time, so maybe Özden and then Ayşe, and as a concluding
I will be
comment and question.
just a small point again, but after Özden.
Hocam, I'm shortly asking some questions. I would like to also look at this subject with the concept of counter monuments, or with the anti-monumental concept. In this example, which you present us, when we look at from the history of Turkish Republic term within its secular terms in general, are these kind of initiatives in an anti-monumentalistic style, counter-memorial style maybe, or is it a totally monumentalistic example which shows these political terms, victory and power as today's dominant political view? Or is it like a dilemma between two?
There is no doubt that there is a very strong monumentalist basic, how should I put it, posture within which, you know, these museums and museal, broader museal spaces are being orchestrated, irrespective of what sort of religious coloring you have in those examples. But, and then there is also somehow a counter memory, you know, process going on. And again, we need to sift through this carefully, because even though you know, the AKP has been running the country for quite some time by now, but still has a tendency to victimize itself, right? To victimize that we Muslims are still being, you know, victims to being invisible, being forgotten in history, etc. So I think that's sort of the counter memory discourse lives very strongly, even when it's being formulated from above, and actually aiming to then shut down other narratives. So I think it's a little bit of a competition for the victimhood going around here, hand in hand with a very monumentalist, you know, architectonic posture and style in the orchestration of various types of nationalist memory. So it's very little room for subtlety in those discourses, I would say. And if we look, I'm right now also doing a more detailed analysis of the actual historical narrative of the Panorama Museum, which then really has the ambition to write a positive, correct, critical historical account of what happened, but still in a very strongly idealized and nationalist flavor, I would say. So in that sense, even when the history museums and other museums are trying or inviting some sort of a more, say, an objective perspective, they remain strongly influenced by a specific historical discourse. I think that, you know, but I think the monumentality thing is really worth thinking with. And I thank you for mentioning that, because I haven't used that so far, but it's really worth looking at. Thanks.
Yes, John, thank you.
Yeah, mine again was a small short note that that last discussion reminded me that's about the, you know, that standardization of people's behavior and ruralization of rituals and so on and so forth. But if you have ever been to Hacı Bayram in Ankara, you would see, you know, rules over there, you know, do's and do nots, codes of conduct. And most of the, you know, has the researchers tended to interpret these rules as the, you know, some rigid rules or Kemalist rules or, you know, secularist rules. No, exactly not. These are coming from the Naqshbandi sobriety, all right? And therefore now we are talking about the building of orthodoxy, right? So therefore those, you know, attempts to get rid of all these, you know, uncivilized behaviors and so on and so forth, they're not coming from non-religious sources. Religious sources themselves, all right, Naqshbandiya, you know, as it's been, and we know how it's been, you know, constructed, because it came out as being, quite against of syncretism. They tried to maintain and provide a kind of purification in Islam, all right? And then that kind of sobriety has also been, provided by the religious forces themselves. But again, they have been really wrongly and hastily tended to be interpreted. Look, those behaviors of poor people, rural people are forbidden by the nationalist Kemalist forces. No, it was not the case actually, all right? So there are, of course, some rules over there, but again, as you have mentioned, we should be very careful about the layers and the intersections of those layers when it comes to talk about religion and the making of and building of an orthodoxy. All right, and so it's just so prolific to remind us lots of points. Thank you so much, Janson.
Oh, thank you so much. I cannot, I completely agree. And this also means that I just wish that there would be even more people who are involved in these discussions. But I think it's coming. More and more, work done on this and related. And I think, for instance, now Caterina Rodvere's book is one important step on the way, and hopefully, it will come. We need to have these detailed historical studies of what actually has transpired, so we don't fall into these traps of, overgeneralizations, which is, I completely agree.
Barış?
If you have time, I'm just to follow up the previous discussion and to correct myself, maybe. I mean, I was trying to say we are, I guess, more conceptualizing power in the form of sacralization, and in this case, with the case of museum, like what I was saying. It's like these non-museal spaces show as another regime of power. So it is not like how the ruler's intention is to produce that sacred, or the way the power is working through the sacred, producing what is sacred. That signification is more the way we elaborate power. But here we have to see how simultaneously it is again working as a regime of power, not as resistance. That's why I'm underlining that. So it is not just how the cultural diversities will always prevent the power to work in these homogeneous forms is another question. But I was just trying to think of, and not that's why not as a question. That's why it was very striking for me to think of that profanization as a regime of power that is going along with that sacralization. So it's not contrasting that. It is not just disturbing or distorting the power, but it is simultaneously opening another space of power. That's very interesting to think, I guess. So it breaks down our general thinking of power as again upside down, actually. Top-down understanding. So, but it again diffuses, to use again a Goldian term, but it doesn't have to work in the same mechanism or with the same signs. Actually, the content might be similar, but it operates on a very different level, which again produces, as Ayşe Hoca and Margaret Hoca said, similar effects in different variations. That's interesting to think. So that's why it was very thinking it's quite striking.
Yeah, and I think here of course we can fall back on many of our favorites, theoretical paradigms to think about this. I mean, it can be Foucauldian, it can also be Lefebvrean. To understand the production of space simultaneously as spatial practices from below, as representations from above, and as a mediate zone of representational spaces that can be reappropriated from below or from above, and in various forms. And so I think a combination here. I'm also I haven't really been looking systematically been involved in Foucault's heterotopia concept. I think it has a lot to give for museal studies. I know there has been quite a lot written on it, But I also find the texts written by Foucault on this topic are so confused and confusing. So I've been a little bit wary to start there. But I think heterotopic spaces are one way of, somehow understanding these spaces very far from top down or bottom up, but as very dynamic, organic, malleable spaces. So it's that's perhaps one way to go about this.
Well, thank you very much, Torsten. On behalf of the department and all the attendees, I would like to thank you again for this stimulating presentation. I think it was obviously stimulating from the number and the quality of the exchanges. So we'll have probably one talk every month. We'll try to do this. So we'll probably have a talk to conclude the fall semester around mid-January, and then probably in March after the break between the semesters. Yeah. So stay tuned to our usual channels of diffusion for the next talks. And thanks again. Do you want to, Ayşe, maybe, do you want to give last word?
I just want to, thank you all for a super exciting and stimulating discussion. Not least, I was exactly everything I hoped for in complexity and provocative and thought-provocative questions. So I'm very happy with and thank you so much for creating this opportunity for me.
We thank you, Torsten, and I would say anything other than thank you, and come again. And we would love to see the follow-up of your works. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, everyone. And I'll be sending you the YouTube link if you're interested once we post it.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.
See you. Happy year.
Happy New Year.
Happy year.